Welcome everyone to the Kimberlite Subsea Services webinar. My name is David Batt. I'm president of Kimberlite Research, and I'm glad that you're able to join us today. This is the 9th Kimberlite webinar series. Our past webinars have included reviews of many of the most commonly used oilfield products and services in the industry, such as intervention services, directional drilling services, including downhole mud motors, MWD, rotary steerables, drill bits, drilling fluids, cementing services, surface wellheads, artificial lift, hydraulic fracturing, production chemicals, and many others. We've also taken deep regional dives into the Permian Basin, and we've also provided comprehensive reviews of the big three oilfield service suppliers, Schlumberger, Halliburton, and Baker Hughes. And just last month, we reviewed the adoption of digital technologies, ranging from machine learning and the use of cloud technologies amongst the oil and gas operators globally, as well as operators' plans to invest in alternative energy investments. Let us know if you or your colleagues need access to these previous webinars, to send us an email or a chat message, and we'll be glad to work with you to get access. Today, we'll be reviewing the competitive landscape for the subsea services market. This includes inspection, maintenance, and repair, ROV services, IWOCs, multi-phase flow meters, and test trees, as well as taking a look at the use of digital technologies and remote operation technologies in the subsea services sector. Feel free to submit questions during the presentation today via chat box or email, and we'll address your questions during the presentation. For those of you that may not be familiar with Kimberlite Research, I'll provide a brief background on and about what we do at Kimberlite, and then we'll dive into the subsea services review. Each year, Kimberlite Research conducts approximately 3,000 one-on-one personal phone interviews with E&P operators and users worldwide. Some of you on the webinar today may have participated in one of our industry surveys, and for that, I say thank you. I think the more collaboration we have with the oil companies around the world in providing this objective, independent feedback back to the oilfield service suppliers is only a positive for our industry. Our research is about 50% international and about 50% North America. Through these 3,000 one-on-one personal interviews each year, we produce a series of reports ranging from formation evaluation, drilling, completion, production, subsea, and next week we'll be publishing our benchmark report on pipeline integrity management and inline inspection services. Today, we'll be focusing our findings in our webinar today on the subsea services market, based on interviews with 115 subsea oil and gas customers worldwide, who in aggregate are responsible for managing and operating about 3,800 subsea wells. The data set that we'll be presenting to you is fairly rich and multidimensional. One of the exhibits that we'll be using in our presentation today, and I'd just like to make sure everyone's familiar with this quadrant map or value map here, is where we cross-plot supplier performance on the x-axis against pricing competitiveness on the y-axis. Suppliers that plot in the top right-hand quadrant are viewed as premium suppliers that may charge prices higher than industry norm, but they also deliver performance better than industry average. And so even though they may cost more, they're worth it. Suppliers in the bottom right-hand quadrant are value advantaged. They're viewed as performing through the eyes of the customer. They're viewed as performing better than industry average. Suppliers in the bottom left-hand quadrant are viewed as discount providers. They tend to underperform market averages, but they tend to offset their performance shortcomings with lower than industry norm pricing. So you get what you pay for. And then obviously the top left-hand quadrant are those suppliers that through the eyes of the end users, the oil and gas operators, are not really delivering the best overall value. So with that, let's go ahead and get started into the subsea services report. The feedback from this report came from the interviews captured during the months of February, March, and April of 2021. And this report was published in May of 2021. And to kick things off, one of the first questions that we'd like to dive into is asking the oil and gas operators, where are they experiencing success? This is an open-ended question, and they're free to share any services or technologies or development approaches that are bringing them success and improving the subsea life of field economics. And what we find here is, at the top of the list, improved component reliability. Those are the comments in the areas where we get most of the commentary from the subsea oil and gas operators. In fact, if we go back to the 2019 survey in red, and even the 2016 survey, which is not pictured in this exhibit, component reliability has always been kind of a leading area where FMC and OneSubsea and Aker Solutions and Baker Hughes have been continuing to redesign, improving material quality and components for the subsea equipment to last longer. But we're beginning to see some shifts in 2021. You'll see topics like digital technologies and software and data analytics and artificial intelligence, more monitoring, remote operations. These topics are beginning to be mentioned at a much higher level than previously in previous studies from 2016 and 2019. In fact, when we asked the subsea oil and gas operators, how will subsea developments and operations of the future be different than the way we design today? And again, this is an open-ended, unaided question. They're free to talk about anything they'd like to. You can tell that the topic of digitization and data analytics is at the very top of the list. And in fact, in 2016, not pictured on this exhibit, the topic of digitization and data analytics was not even mentioned in 2016. So you can just see the rapid velocity at which the digitization and data analytics, automation and drones and robotics, remote operations, these are all themes and topics that are rising to the top of priority and key strategic objectives for the subsea oil and gas operators globally. And this is a major change from what we saw just 3, 4, 5 short years ago. So it's clear that digitization and remote operations is continuing to play an increasing role for the subsea oil and gas operators. So we took a little bit deeper dive on these topics. And what we find is approximately 46 to 49% of the subsea operators will clearly affirm that digitization and remote operations is anticipated to have a very major impact on their future subsea operations. When we ask them more specifically about where they expect these benefits to be realized, and again, this is an open-ended, unaided question that we pose to the subsea oil and gas operators, what we find is that the subsea oil and gas operators believe that digitization and remote operations will clearly drive improved decision-making, more reliable operations, improved efficiency. Obviously, remote operations will pull fewer personnel from having to go offshore. That's going to improve safety profiles and bring more efficient operations. Obviously, by changing the way in which we serve and serve the market with fewer personnel and fewer trips to the field using remote monitoring and digitization technologies, that will also have a reduced carbon footprint impact as well. What the subsea oil and gas operators really need from the suppliers like FMC, OneSubsea, Aker, Baker Hughes, and others is they need increased collaboration to keep updated with the technologies and how they're developing. We're able to achieve things today in 2021 that, quite frankly, in 2016, 17, and 18 are not quite being fully implemented or possible. And so the rate of technology is advancing and the capabilities are advancing. In addition, they need case studies and examples of where remote monitoring has played a role. Some subsea oil and gas operators have been monitoring subsea equipment on the seafloor for 5 or 10 years or more. Other subsea operators are just now beginning to enter that phase at a more increasing level beyond what they simply would have monitored in the past, like a subsea tree or a control system or such. When you start to take a look at the expenditure plans amongst the subsea oil and gas operators, and this is the diffusion index, on a global worldwide basis, you have about 51% of the subsea oil and gas operators communicating that their budgetary plans and expenditure levels are really going to remain relatively unchanged moving forward into 2021 versus 2020. But you do have about 32% of the subsea oil and gas operators indicating that they'll be increasing expenditures and only 17% reducing. So the diffusion index of 57.5 indicates that we are continuing to see expansion in this market in terms of the continued increase in spending. The diffusion index, albeit, is lower than that observed in 2019. So the rate of spending increases is declining a little bit. When we take a look at the distribution of the typical subsea oil and gas operator, what we find is that there's been some changes in the last 4 or 5 years. The percentage of their expenditure budget for monitoring, be it downhole well monitoring or monitoring of subsea equipment on the seafloor, has increased to about 19% of a typical operator's subsea budget. And that the percentage of their expenditures in their budget for downhole workovers and subsea equipment repair has declined. So if you go to 2016, when we conducted the survey for the very first time in 2016, you can see that monitoring and digitization in analytic type technologies only comprised about 4% of their typical budget. Equipment repair and maintenance comprised nearly half their budget, and downhole well workovers comprised about 29% of their budget. So what we see is, as the oil and gas operators begin to emphasize more with digitization and monitoring and remote operations and such, what we're finding is they're able to extend equipment life, they're able to reduce equipment repair and maintenance and push that out to the right a little bit, and they're also able to reduce their overall expenditures as a part of their budget for downhole well workovers. So clearly we see some major shifts and changes in how the oil and gas operators in the subsea sector are spending their money, and they're certainly following through on the word of the future, what we talked about earlier, how they plan to make greater use of remote technologies and monitoring and digitization moving forward. When we ask the subsea oil and gas operators where they get the biggest return on their investment, historically and still today, they talk about subsea tiebacks, and as a consequence, you see these short cycle projects taking place. Even in the downturn of 2015, you saw subsea tiebacks. In many cases, the tiebacks were being extended from 10 to 20 miles or 20 miles to 40 miles because 40 to 46% of the operators view that they get a high impact, high return on investment here. What you do see, though, is in 2019, only 12% of the subsea operators believe that they received a high return on investment from investments in digital technologies and infrastructure, including machine learning and artificial intelligence. That has increased from 12% in 2019 up to 32% in 2021. Again, another reaffirmation of operators are beginning to get a little bit more track record, a little bit more experience in utilizing these technologies. Boosting workovers and reservoir monitoring, including 4D seismic, are viewed by about 1 in 4 of the subsea operators is providing a good return on investment. The other thing, too, we like to track before diving into the competitive landscape is the impact of these alliances between the subsea equipment suppliers like FMC and the vessel contractors like Technip, or in the case of Schlumberger, they've aligned with Helix and Subsea 7 through alliances. You may recall in 2016 when Technip FMC announced that they were going to be coming together, which formally took place around January of 2017, that it was envisioned that the coming together of the subsea equipment suppliers and vessel contractors would bring transformational benefits to the subsea industry. And you can see that only about 1/3 of the subsea oil and gas operators back in 2016 and 2019 were seeing positive impacts of the coming together of these alliances. But that's increased now to 46%, approaching 50%. And amongst the subsea oil and gas operators that see benefit from this, and we ask them open-ended question, where do you see the benefit? And we read through the verbatim comments, what we find is that the benefits that are being seen through this integration of the alliances of the contractors, vessel contractors, and suppliers really does resonate quite well and tie into what was originally envisioned back in 2016. Operators are seeing improved operational integration and execution, some cost savings, improved availability and flexibility in scheduling, better access to subject matter experts and resources and engineering teams, and even some improved communications. And so we anticipate that many of these projects are very long cycle. It can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years for subsea oil and gas operators to really realize the full benefit of what these alliances can bring. I would expect that that this will grow to probably 2/3 of the market, seen in a positive light There'll always be a subsegment of the market that views this in a negative light with reduced customer choice and so forth. With that, I'd like to go ahead and just dive into the subsea equipment maintenance and repair section of our report. What we find here is about 30% of the subsea fields globally are experiencing some form of obsolescence issue. And when we ask the operators what equipment they're facing the biggest obsolescence issues with, what we find is it's really with the electronics and the subsea control systems. And as a consequence of this, you see companies like ProServe and others stepping into this field to be able to, help shorten the timeline to get these control systems retrofitted and updated with advanced electronics for 2021. Many of these subsea control systems are quite old. But given what we just talked about with the fact that digitization and data analytics is going to play a greater role of the subsea fields of the future, having updated subsea control systems is going to be very important. And those suppliers that have subsea control systems in the install base, Aker Solutions probably has nearly 1,000 control systems out in the field, and same thing probably with FMC, a little bit less, but that's very critical because everything that we'll be monitoring on the C4 will be plugging into those control systems. When we take a look at the components that fail most often, subsea control modules usually have to be replaced 2 to 3 times over the life of a typical subsea well, say over about 20 years. Subsea chokes are having to be changed out about twice, particularly as we start to see upgrades with different trim designs and improved resolution and accuracy of the choke. Pressure temperature sensors and subsea connections tend to be replaced about 1 time during the life of a typical subsea well. When we take a look at the subsea equipment that's being monitored on the seafloor, about 44% of the wells are reported as having equipment being monitored on the seafloor. Much of this obviously begins with just monitoring trees and control systems, but it's beginning to expand to subsea chokes and pipelines and connection systems and flow lines and such. When we take a look at the suppliers that are most commonly used for subsea equipment repair and maintenance services, it's certainly no surprise that TechnipFMC and Schlumberger have the highest market penetration, being used by nearly 50% of all the subsea operators globally. You can see that we can track and benchmark this from survey year to survey year. We conducted the survey first in 16, updated it in 19, and again in 2021. The next update will be in 2023. We alternate each year between subsea services and subsea equipment. You can see that also that no surprise, Schlumberger and TechnipFMC have about half of the market. When we ask the subsea oil and gas operators to rate the performance of their subsea repair and maintenance service suppliers, we find that on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being outstanding performance and 1 being very poor performance, we see quite a bit of variance in the performance levels of the various suppliers. So from the perspective of an oil company, what we're seeing from the feedback from the oil and gas operators is not all of these suppliers are performing the same. Some are getting average ratings in the 6s on a scale of 1 to 10. Some are getting average ratings closer to 9. And so when you benchmark and you trend the performance of these various suppliers, you see quite a bit of variability. And so if you take a look at, say, who's here at the top here, ProServe, granted they're small, followed by Oceaneering, much smaller than TechnipFMC or OneSubsea. But the customers that are using ProServe and Oceaneering give them customer review ratings that are consistently year on year higher than the industry average, which is the dash line, and higher than the big 4 integrateds, Baker Hughes, Schlumberger, FMC, and Aker Solutions. And so by being able to objectively benchmark this through the voice of the operator allows us to be able to identify which subsea suppliers are delivering some of the best performance and some of the best value. When we translate this to the value map that we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar that we'll be making great use of, and we cross-plot supplier performance on the x-axis against perceived pricing competitiveness on the y-axis, you find that a lot of these smaller to mid-tier suppliers, be it ProServe or Oceaneering or many others that we kind of just aggregate together as all others, are really viewed as delivering the best overall value. Amongst the big 4 integrated, the big 2, TechnipFMC's performance declined in 2021 versus 2019. in Subsea 1 Subsea is viewed pretty strongly in this premium quadrant. Although they may cost a little bit more than industry norm, they're certainly worth it in terms of overall performance and value. If you look at TechnipFMC, their performance has declined. And even though TechnipFMC's performance has declined, it's not like it's just fallen off the cliff here. It's just that their customer review ratings have declined in face of the fact that the overall industry performance review ratings are improving. So the overall market is improving slightly. TechnipFMC's performance is declining. And so those lines are converging to where you've got a wider and wider dislocation between the value that TechnipFMC is viewed as delivering versus the rest of the market. You certainly see in the Gulf of Mexico where TechnipFMC exhibits its highest performance deficiencies. Baker Hughes and Aker Solutions have a much lower presence in the Gulf of Mexico today than prior. And so it's really TechnipFMC and Subsea are really the two major suppliers in the Gulf of Mexico, along with Oceanarian and ProServe. And you can see Oceanarian and ProServe, again, are advantaged. ProServe really specializes in subsea control systems. Oceanarian has umbilicals and IWOCs and such. When you move internationally, the competitive landscape changes quite a bit. Technip and Subsea become a little bit tighter. Oceanarian and ProServe remain in a value advantaged position. Moving on to ROV services, one of the things we find in ROV services is that the oil and gas operators are looking for improvements of ROV reliability and uptime to be able to stay underwater longer for longer missions, improved camera and visualization systems with real-time streaming. Coupled with cloud, you can do real-time data analytics and real-time or near real-time reporting. With improved tool changing capabilities, that allows the ROV vessels to be a little bit more multidimensional and stay underwater longer without having to come to surface to change out tools. And then with automation capabilities and piloting, it takes some of the variability out. And so, by improving maintenance programs and improving the camera and resolution systems along with piloting, these are going to be the new innovations for the ROV of the futures that will be coming out. When you take a look at the major ROV suppliers, it's very clear that Oceanarian is the dominant provider in the market. They have the deepest market penetration. They also have the highest market share. But when you look at the supplier performance ratings amongst the various ROV suppliers, again, just like we saw for IMR services, we see quite a bit of variability between the various suppliers. They're not homogeneously performing the same. Amongst the key ROV service suppliers, Oceanarian, who's the market share leader, and by some viewed as the technology leader, is consistently receiving customer review ratings that are higher than the industry average. They're fairly consistent from year to year, and they're consistently higher than industry average. Many of these other suppliers, you see that their performance is either declining or increasing, but not remaining nearly as stable of that of Oceanarian. As a consequence, Oceanarian clearly differentiates himself in the market as being a premium-based supplier. Clearly, they may not be the lowest cost ROV supplier in the market, but they're certainly viewed as delivering the best overall performance, and they're very consistent from year to year. A lot of these other suppliers are kind of moving around from year to year. TechnipFMC is entering the market with the new Gemini series for drill support. Let's see how that plays out. You can see that DOF Subsea, and Subsea 7 are competitively disadvantaged and showing some vulnerabilities in the marketplace. And Fugro is positioned down as a discount provider. Gulf of Mexico, Oceanarian very dominant. International, Oceanarian very dominant, showing very consistent performance. Moving into downhole well interventions and workovers, what we find is that approximately 7.6% of the subsea wells globally will require downhole well intervention. And on average, a subsea well can operate 7 to almost 8 years before, on average, it will require some form of a downhole well intervention. Unlike when I came out in the early 2000s of working for Chevron, we thought that the subsea wells would only last for a few years, but these wells are lasting 20 years. And so now these typical wells or subsea wells are experiencing nearly 2.5 to 3 downhole well workovers during the life cycle of a typical well. If you take a look at the problems these subsea wells are most commonly experiencing, sand debris, downhole valve failures, deposit control issues, and water breakthrough, a lot of these reservoir type issues are really best handled by companies like Subsea, Baker Hughes, and Halliburton that have the downhole reservoir and tool capabilities. You can certainly have a lot of other vessel companies that are out there that can bring vessels to the table and handle specialty type applications such as pumping chemicals down to the tree or choke insert or manifold to address deposition control issues. And so you are starting to see a growing use of the vessels with and without riser. In the 2015 downturn, it was such an abundant supply of drilling rigs and affordable rates that I think it really has hindered the adoption towards the vessels. But these vessels will continue to grow in interest in adoption because they specialize in a lot of these services that need to be performed on these subsea wells, whereas a drilling rig isn't necessarily the most efficient way to go about doing it. So we'll continue to track this as well. Moving into the intervention workover control systems, we find that there are many, many suppliers that are being used, with Subsea, Oceanair, and TechnipFMC having the deepest market penetration, followed by Baker Hughes and Aker Solutions. Again, we see quite a bit of variability in the performance profiles of these suppliers. And here, if you look at this performance trend tile map for intervention for IWOCs, you see that there's quite a bit of variability. Again, you see ProServe and Oceanair consistently receiving customer review ratings that are higher than the industry average. You see other suppliers consistently receiving customer review ratings that are below the industry average. When you look at the competitive landscape, you see that Oceanair and ProServe are viewed as delivering some of the best overall value in the IWOCs market. Halliburton is really kind of more positioned as a discount provider using low price to kind of enter that market, and they've announced some alliances recently as well in this space. Amongst the big four integrateds, Subsea Subsea is probably viewed as delivering the best overall value. TechnipFMC is competitively disadvantaged, along with Baker Hughes and Aker Solutions. When you look at test trees and landing strings, this is a market that's largely dominated by Subsea and Expro. TechnipFMC has recently entered the market, and of course Halliburton's been in the market for the last five or 6 years or so. When you look at the competitive landscape for subsea test trees, what we find is that Expro is really viewed as the value-based alternative to Subsea Subsea. You can see that Halliburton again is positioned as a discount provider. We find that even though TechnipFMC is a relatively newer entrant in the space, they are exhibiting some competitive disadvantages and some vulnerabilities in the subsea test tree market. Moving on to subsea multi-phase flow meters, what we find is that the share of subsea wells using multi-phase flow meters has increased from 2016 at about 29% up to the current 46% level. And about 1 in 3 of the oil and gas operators are willing to consider use of a virtual subsea flow meter in lieu of a physical. Again, this ties into what we talked about earlier about the adoption of remote monitoring and analytics and digitization type technologies to replace maybe what would have been done physically in the past. Here, Subsea, you may recall, purchased Framo several years ago, and TechnipFMC purchased MPM, and Emerson has Roxar. And so those are the 3 major providers in the subsea multi-phase flow meter. Historically, Emerson has always underperformed Subsea, Framo, and TechnipFMC NPM, but Emerson's performance ratings have improved in recent years to where now it's a much tighter market competitively than what's been observed historically, say over the last 5 or 10 years that we've been tracking this market. Moving to plug and abandonments and decommissioning, what we find is that most subsea oil and gas operating companies describe themselves as really not being the most proactive on their P&As. They're going to meet the regulatory requirements, and they're going to try to delay the P&As as long as possible. So, 14 to 24% of the oil and gas operators, depending upon the survey year, would describe themselves as being fairly proactive. But basically, 80 to 90% of the operators tend to want to kind of push out to the right as long as possible, these plug and abandonments. About 10.8% of the wells amongst the operators we talked to and surveyed describe their installed base as even as having idle wells or temporarily abandoned wells. And then, when we run our analytics, we just continually find that the pace of subsea plugging and abandonment of subsea oil and gas wells continues to be at a pace of about 40 wells per year. And so even though there's thousands of subsea oil and gas wells globally out there in the market, only a very small number are really currently on schedule to be plugged and abandoned on an annual basis. If we step back and just kind of sum up the market in aggregate, what we find is you've got the big four integrated subsea oil and gas providers: Schlumberger, TechnipFMC, Baker Hughes, and Aker Solutions. All four of those companies have a very strong legacy of supplying the subsea industry. And they offer a fairly full integrated lineup of capabilities, either directly or indirectly through their alliances. What we find amongst these big four integrateds is that their pricing strategies overall in aggregate, if you take into account subsea equipment and services, so on this graph we're looking at trees, control systems, manifolds, umbilicals, all of the equipment, but also of all the services that we talked about: IWOX, test trees, IMR, and such like that. Their pricing strategies seem to be fairly well aligned overall in aggregate. The biggest difference that we see is in performance profile, where Schlumberger OneSubsea really does stand out. The Cameron Group, if you will, is delivering some of the better overall performance amongst the big four integrateds. And so that's kind of what the big four looks like. But we also see a large number of independent operators that have strong degrees of specialties, like Masterflow for subsea chokes, ProServes for subsea control system and IWOX, DrillQuip for subsea wellheads, Helix for vessels and intervention vessels. Oceaneering has vessels, they have IWOX, they have ROVs, they have umbilicals. And you find that a lot of these smaller companies, although they're not fully integrated like the Schlumberger, TechnipFMC, Aker Solutions, or Baker, within the areas in which they do operate, they certainly deliver strong value. So for oil and gas operating companies that are looking for hybrid supply chain models, trying to seek out some best-in-class performance and value and customer experiences, there are several options in the marketplace to go to, rather than 100% of the time always bundling everything with a fully integrated. And so with that, I'm going to stop here. We've been going for about 30 minutes, and this kind of summarizes some of the key findings from the Subsea Life of Field Services report for 2021. Again, just to reiterate, some of the key sea changes that we see taking place is just the emphasis that the oil and gas operators are placing as strategic importance for investments in digital technologies, from increased monitoring, increased data analytics, increased use of remote operations. And we really think that this will continue to kind of drive the future of the subsea oil and gas market, particularly for subsea. We also see increased interest in the use of fiber optics to be used with the subsea trees, increased use of electric systems as well. And so we'll continue to track this at Kimberlite Research. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about, want to delve in more deeply on any one of these topics. And we're certainly available to assist. For those of you that are attending the webinar that are oil and gas operators, we'd like to thank you for your collaboration and for your participation in our surveys. Thanks to your gift of feedback, we're able to benchmark objectively the competitive landscapes and help to kind of amplify and highlight areas of the market that need improvement and suppliers that tend to stand out as going that extra mile and delivering that little extra value. Probably next month in July, we'll be highlighting the Pipeline Integrity Management Report and Inline Inspection Report. That's a benchmark report for pipelines and integrity management. And certainly that's been a hot topic in the market lately, particularly with the hacking of the Colonial Pipeline back earlier in May. But pipelines are a vital asset to the oil and gas industry. And so we look forward to covering that market with you in the month of July. So stay tuned for those announcements, and I'd like to thank you for your attendance here today. With that, we'll end the webinar. Bye now.